21. Sir Godfrey proved a particularly delightful traveling companion. Not only was he a solid weight at her back, sheltering her from the wind, but he was particularly knowledgeable about the places below them, for he'd traveled through many of them since leaving his home. In one town, Pegasus had thrown a shoe, and it had taken both Godfrey and Zoticus to rouse the inebriated blacksmith, and several tries before the smith had managed to fasten the shoe on the right hoof. In a tiny hamlet, every man of fighting age had chosen to take up the cross and march with the crusaders. When he'd left another village, he'd discovered a cat had given birth to a litter of kittens in his saddlebag, and Zoticus had nearly expired with laughter as Godfrey had needed to don his gloves over his bleeding hands to evict the mother and her offspring, wrapped in his warmest woolen tunic, for the cat could not be detached from the wool without ripping it to pieces. Water wheels that turned mills, men who lived most of their lives on horseback, their homes little more than tents that traveled in their saddlebags, ruins of cities older than living memory. It was like listening to him telling tales of the infidels conquering the holy city, only better, because this time his words came with rich images from Godfrey's memory. "I talk too much, my lady. Surely you have plenty of tales to tell." She shook her head. "I spend most of my day weaving and sewing. I could tell you a tale about the trials and tribulations of weaving my friend's bridal veil, but I fear it would put you to sleep. I'm much more interested in tales of your adventures. Please, will you tell me what happened to the cat? Did you find her a nice warm barn somewhere, or, did they even have barns in the place where you found her? Or were you among those tent people?" He laughed and continued where he'd left off. Penelope did not want the ride to end, but she knew it must. At least she had the return journey with him to look forward to, for he was determined to see her safely home. "Where in Bizzers do you wish to go first?" Godfrey asked. Penelope shrugged. "Just set down somewhere that there will be space. If Bizzers was anything like Rialto, there would be open space near the prison and the palace, and both would not be far from one another." Godfrey chuckled. "At least I am not the only one to underestimate Bizzers. Wait until you see the city." He pointed over her shoulder. Penelope squinted. She thought she could see the ocean, white foam as waves broke on hidden rocks and shoals, and behind it. She gasped. Walls rose up from the sea itself, impossibly high and white, stretching for miles until they curved back around the largest city she had ever seen. Why, Rialto would fit inside those walls 10 times over. Maybe more. Penelope took a deep breath. "The prison then. There is no point going to the palace unless I'm sure my people are still alive." The Enchanted Horse responded to her wishes, landing in the yard outside the prison. People crowded around the edges of the yard and on the walls of the prison, pointing. Penelope had never seen so many people in one place. Not even at the trial of the pigs, when all of Rialto turned out to see justice done. "I should stay to protect you while you do whatever you need to," Godfrey said, reaching for his sword. Fear rippled through the crowd, and Godfrey too. One sword was little use against a mob of thousands. He knew it, but his vow would not allow him to leave. Penelope scanned their thoughts. Their fear was tempered by curiosity. The people were not a mob, and were more likely to run away from the flying horse than toward it. To tell the emperor that his horse had returned, she realized the same time as Godfrey did. "Perhaps we should fly to the palace first, so I can show the emperor I have returned unharmed with his horse," Godfrey said. She took a deep breath. "You go to the palace and do what you must. I will stay here with the horse and find out what I can." When he hesitated, she added, "Should anyone approach me, I will fly away." Godfrey eyed the prison walls. "There are archers up there." She managed a smile. "I shall fly higher than their arrows and return after dark, when it is safe." Finally, he nodded. "Promise me you will stay on the horse's back. If there's anything I learned in my night training, it's that you have the high ground on horseback, and the advantage over anyone who isn't. She patted the worn wood. "I will be here when you return." He dismounted, then strode across the yard until he vanished into the crowd. Alone. Alone amongst thousands. Penelope drew in a deep breath, then expelled it slowly. She cast her gift wide, a net encompassing the prison. Pain and despair hit her first, from the dungeons where the guards tortured criminals for information and their own enjoyment, but she moved deeper into the building. Despair swirled through her mind, thicker here, but the pain had dulled somewhat, to a niggling ache that would not go away. A child's voice rose above the rest, outraged that he was required to do his schooling without his abacus. Penelope couldn't help but smile. Definitely the child of some Rialto merchant. She had found them. Thousands of her people crowded into cells, filling cellars that had once held provisions. Grim, resolute, worried, fearing no help would come, and yet still there was hope. They might be prisoners, but they had not been tortured. Families huddled together, hunger gnawing at the edge of their thoughts as they waited for their dinner. A dinner that would be paltry compared to what they'd enjoyed in their own homes, but enough to survive. Hostages. That's what they were. Not ordinary prisoners, but ones the emperor planned to release. At least, that's what their leaders believed. The only way to find out would be to ask the emperor himself. Or read his thoughts. One man among thousands, millions maybe. But she knew Godfrey's mind, and he was headed for the emperor. He approached the palace even now, climbing the steps to the throne room. Telling his business to the herald, who nodded and sent a messenger to the emperor himself. The present petitioners were from one of Rialto's rival port cities. Without their hats, she couldn't be certain which one, but the smudged ash on their foreheads marked them as members of the same faith as her own, instead of the Eastern one more common in Bizes. Hatred for the petitioners burned from one of the men at the base of the dais. An old warrior, accustomed to commanding troops, but willing to wade into the fray with his sword until the blade ran red. He wanted to do that now. To slaughter the petitioners and everyone like them, who did not share his Eastern religion. When the emperor succumbed to his illness and his young son took the throne, this general intended to seize power, be named regent, and order the massacre. He was practically salivating at the idea. Shuddering, Penelope sought some thoughts that were less horrifying. She turned to the child on the dais, who could not have been more than 6 years old. This was Alexios, the emperor's eldest son, and his mind was a stormy tantrum the like of which Penelope would have expected in a toddler. He wanted to play and eat sweet things and not stand on the dais with his father. Only the fear of another blow from his father stopped him from giving voice to the screaming tantrum. Her father planned to marry her to that spoiled child? The marriage could not be consummated for a decade at least. Would she be able to bear children then? Not for long. And the young emperor would need heirs. She shook her head and plunged into the emperor's thoughts. He at least was listening to the petitioners, but nothing they said would change his mind. They wanted him to give them the imprisoned Rialto merchant's property. Something he could not do, for he'd seized it to fill his empty treasury. As he would surely seize her and her dowry. No wonder father had not finished negotiating her betrothal to this prince. The emperor would seize her dowry, leaving her barren and penniless. Probably imprison her with her people, where she would wait until the emperor died and the bloodbath began. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could not seem to draw any air in. Choking, she bit down hard on her lip to block all other thoughts from her head except her own. Spots obscured her vision as she became aware that the constriction in her throat was real, not imagined, as a man's hands tightened around her neck. Fly. She threw herself forward on the horse's neck, desperately reaching for the nail. But blackness found her first. 22. This audience is at an end. All those who desire an audience with His Imperial Majesty, assemble outside the doors at dawn on the morrow, the herald announced. Godfrey jerked out of his reverie and moved to follow the crowd. The herald seized his arm. Not you. You are commanded to stay and show the Emperor this horse immediately. Immediately meant something different in Bizzes, Godfrey soon learned. The Emperor required refreshments and a change of clothing while his coach and a squad of guards were assembled at the palace gates. This included a horse for Godfrey to ride as he led the procession. He had to duck his head to hide his amusement at this unasked-for gift of a palace horse, too late for it to be of any use to him. But it would get him back to Penelope sooner. He wished he hadn't left her alone, but what danger could she come to in broad daylight in a very public square? As she'd said, she had the enchanted horse, she could easily fly away from trouble. Yet he could not help worrying. The crowd outside the prison had dispersed, probably headed home for dinner. Or perhaps they didn't trust their monarch not to send them to the dungeons for getting in his way. Neither would have surprised Godfrey, not after what Penelope had told him. To imprison thousands of your own people simply because they came from a particular city. One of your loyal subject cities, no less. It begged belief. A shout came from ahead, and Godfrey urged his horse to move faster. He reached the yard outside the prison, the empty yard. No horse, no Penelope. Oh God! Godfrey slid from his horse and dropped to his knees to pray she was safe. Up there! Shoot him, shoot him! The cry came from behind him, and it took Godfrey a moment to realize what the guards were pointing at. The enchanted horse floated high above, with a cloaked figure atop it, and a bundle draped across the horse's neck. Something dropped from the bundle, plummeting to the ground. Godfrey scrambled to his feet and ran to reach it first. It was Lady Penelope's boot, still warm. Someone had stolen her and the horse. Don't shoot! Godfrey bellowed, waving his arms. He's got Lady Penelope of Rialto. Who? The Emperor demanded, sticking his head out of the carriage window like some peculiar kind of sideways turtle. That's the magician. He used some sort of magic to escape from his cell, one of the guards at the prison gate shouted. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. And his countrywoman helped him escape. I knew Rialtines weren't to be trusted, and this proves it. She did, she wouldn't? Godfrey began. But he didn't know, not truly. Perhaps she had planned this all along, duping him into helping her. No. If she'd gone willingly, she would have sat astride the horse, as she had on the way here. Not thrown across the horse like baggage. Somehow the magician had overpowered her, so he could steal the horse from her. That's what had happened. The man who brings me that magician's head may have my daughter's hand in marriage. And if you bring me the woman as well, I will give you anything you ask. The Emperor met Godfrey's gaze for a moment, before disappearing back inside his carriage. The carriage and escorts circled around the yard, then headed back the way they'd come. Leaving Godfrey alone in the yard with the Emperor's horse beside him and the enchanted horse shrinking in the distance as it headed north. Back toward Rialto. Godfrey tucked the boot into his belt and mounted up. Where Penelope led, he would follow. The magician would lose his head and all would be right in the world again. 23. Pain woke Penelope. Her midsection ached like her courses had come early, and her head pounded worse than any hangover she'd ever endured. One of her feet was blissfully numb, but she did not know why. She forced her eyes open, but the darkness remained. It took her a moment to realize it was nighttime. How long had she been unconscious? And where was she? She felt around carefully with her hands and found nothing but smooth, hard wood. Somehow, she'd fallen asleep on the horse. No, not fallen asleep. Someone had choked the air from her lungs, rendering her unconscious, and left her, outside the prison, in an unfamiliar city? No, she could feel a breeze upon her face. A breeze not unlike the cold caress of the clouds as she'd flown with Godfrey. Penelope swallowed. She was flying on the enchanted horse, thrown across it like some chattel. And the man riding it had done this. A man who was definitely not Godfrey. Why take her at all? Why not leave her behind? She concentrated on his thoughts, holding tight to the horse as she tried to divine his intentions. His attention was fixed on the land below. No, the lagoon below, for in the pre-dawn light she could discern the islands of Rialto. Home. His thoughts clashed with hers, a wave of anger and betrayal at a city he wished would vanish beneath the waves. Because he could never go back there, after being exiled. A rich city, a religious city, where he'd been ready to settle down happily until they threw him out. But even then, his luck had held. He'd found the ancient Enchanted Horse in the ruins of a forgotten city and flown back, offering it to the Duke for a pardon and a marriage alliance. But the damned Duke had dismissed him and his horse. Penelope was startled to see her own father's face in the man's thoughts. This man had wanted her to be his wife? Who was he? Not some foreign prince if he'd made his home in Rialto. Home. So close. She fumbled about on the horse's neck, searching for the nail that would draw her blood and give her control of the beast. Her greatest desire right now was to go home and take this man to her father. He'd nearly strangled her, then kidnapped her, more than enough reason to deserve death, the punishment that would be meted out to a returned exile. An exile she had no doubt he deserved, whatever he'd done. The man's voice interrupted her thoughts. Oh, you're awake, are you? No, don't do that. Without warning, he slammed her head against the horse hard, and darkness took her again. 24. Rialto never changed, Godfrey thought, as a gondolier, perhaps the same one as before, pulled him to the ducal palace, where Penelope's father now lived. Godfrey gave his name to a manservant, and settled down to wait. The ruler of Rialto was a busy man. Much like the Emperor of Bizes, he would have far more important matters to deal with than an uninvited visit from a foreign knight. Sir Godfrey. What a pleasure. Godfrey's head jerked up. Rialto might not have changed, but Sebastiano had aged considerably in the years since he'd last seen him. But the Duke's smile was as genuine as ever. I mean Monsignor, I've come about Lady Penelope. Godfrey swallowed. How did you tell a man you'd run away with his daughter, only to have her stolen from you, and spirited away? Duke Sebastiano might be older than his father, but Godfrey had no doubt the man could best him with a sword. Penelope's honor would demand no less than his death. Sebastiano smiled indulgently. The sweetest daughter any man could be blessed with. She has joined the convent at St. Angelo of Concordia, and I cannot imagine a more fitting place for such an angel. I visit her there as often as time permits. Godfrey had to pause to process the Duke's words. He had found her at a convent, but she hadn't mentioned being a nun. No, she definitely talked about marriage. Unless she'd lied. And rescued the magician, his traitorous mind added. Godfrey shook his head. He wouldn't believe that of her. Couldn't. When did you last visit her? Godfrey managed to say. Sebastiano looked thoughtful. Why, it must be a week ago, perhaps longer. She left the convent to attend a friend's wedding on the last day before Lent. My duties as Duke keep me busy here. He didn't know. Didn't know that he'd taken her. Or maybe he did, and the Duke was lying to keep Godfrey from seeing her again. Could you send word to her that I am here? I wish to know that she is well, Godfrey said, hating the awkwardness in his voice, but what else was he to say? He could hardly tell him the truth. He wouldn't leave here alive. I had planned on sending her a gift this very day. A chest of fine silk skeins for her weaving. The finest weavers and dressmakers in the city have begged to be allowed to clothe her, but she will have none of them. She weaves and makes her own clothes. She even made her friend's wedding dress for the wedding last week, though neither the bride or groom was a pauper. Why, my daughter is the envy of every dressmaker in the city, for none can make gowns like she does." Sebastiano beckoned to a servant. "I shall send a note with it now to tell her of your visit, and your kind inquiry after her health." The note was written and dispatched, before the Duke invited Godfrey to join him for dinner, later in the day. Godfrey could not refuse, so with a promise to return later in the day, he departed. He considered hiring a boat to take him to the convent, so he could see for himself if she was there, but he had no guarantees that she would see him. Even if she did, could he bear to look her in the eye, knowing she'd betrayed him? If she had. Even her father likened her to an angel. Surely they couldn't both be mistaken. He wasn't sure what he wanted to hear, that she'd betrayed him but was now safe at home, or that the magician had kidnapped her, and she was now in the devil only knew what kind of danger. A branch scraped his shoulder, and for a moment he thought it was a grasping hand. No, just bare sticks, the first signs of spring blossom starting to show on the branches above. He didn't know what sort of tree it was, or what fruit it might bear in the heat of summer. Penelope would, that day they'd kissed, she'd had leaves in her hair and he'd plucked one to keep. He still had it at home somewhere, a reminder of that perfect moment. He prowled through the trees until he found a small church dedicated to Saint Mark, patron saint of this city. The city Penelope said her marriage would help to save. No, not just the city but its people, the prisoners the emperor kept in his dungeons. Was even that a lie? God, he did not know any more. What was true and what was right and what he should do. First Melisande, then the unknown girl in Bizes, and now Penelope. What kind of knight was he if he could not protect those who could not protect themselves? Never mind Melisandre's killers, he was the one who didn't deserve absolution from joining the crusade. That's why he'd lost the army and the enchanted horse, and now Penelope too. Maybe the magician was right, and he was cursed. Godfrey fell to his knees and prayed. Not for himself, he didn't deserve the saint's attention, but for Penelope, who had seemed so earnestly to want to save her city. To keep her safe. Because if he could save only one woman in his life, it would be her. Hours later, or so it seemed, a hand touched his shoulder. "Sir Godfrey, the Duke is about to sit down to dinner." Godfrey climbed laboriously to his feet, he must have been kneeling for longer than he'd realized, and followed the servant to the ducal palace. The dining room seemed empty without Penelope, though the Duke and plenty of servants were present. Godfrey wasn't sure why he'd hoped. "Sir Godfrey, please sit." The Duke gestured to the seat across from him. "I must beg you to forgive my servants for interrupting you while you were at prayer, but I had an inkling you might need to hear this news sooner rather than later." Godfrey sat, and a cup of wine was thrust into his hand. He wanted to deny his desire to hear whatever news the Duke might have, but he couldn't. Not if it pertained to Penelope. Let her be safe at the convent. Safe and well, no matter what else she had done. Safe and well, and he would forgive her anything, Godfrey prayed silently. "The servant I sent to the convent has returned," the Duke began. "It seems my daughter is not at home. No one has seen her since the start of Lent." Godfrey's heart sank down into his boots. He could not bear to meet her father's eyes, knowing it was his fault this had happened. Wordlessly, he pulled out her boot and set it on the table. He wished it still retained her warmth, but it had gone cold before he'd even left Bizes. "What has happened to her?" the Duke demanded. Did the Duke have dungeons where he tortured people? Godfrey wasn't sure he cared. Not knowing what had happened to Penelope, while knowing it was his fault, was agonizing enough. Godfrey wet his lips, hoping the Duke was not a mind reader like his daughter. She was taken from the convent by a man on an enchanted, flying horse. He took her to Bizes, where she was seen briefly. She dropped her boot as he flew off with her, headed north. I had hoped he came here, as the magician claimed to have come from Rialto. The color drained from Sebastiano's face. A man with a magical flying horse? Oh no. Poor Penelope. What? Who is Lord Valerio? Godfrey demanded. I know of no man of that name. But I do know a man who claimed to have an enchanted flying horse. Leonardo Gabrieli, a pretend priest who seduced nuns and other virtuous women, then accused them of being possessed by the devil so that he might end the affair, before returning to hear their confession and accept money for many masses to be said for their souls. Money he kept for himself, for he was not a priest at all. He was exiled when it all came out, for the courts deemed death too good for him. One of my trading ships marooned him on an uninhabited island to the south, and that was all I heard of him, until a few months ago. He sent me a letter, thanking me for choosing that island, for there he'd unearthed a trove of riches, including a priceless magical artifact, an enchanted flying horse. He offered it to me in exchange for recalling him from exile, and giving him my daughter to be his wife. Naturally, I refused. No father who loved his daughter would willingly give her to the very devil himself. Godfrey squeezed his eyes shut. What had he done? He rose. I swear to you I will find her and bring her home to you. The Emperor himself has already called for the magician's head. I pray I will be the first to find him, so I can deliver that to you as well. The Duke rose too. Bring her home safely and I will give you anything you ask. Rescuing Penelope from the devil's clutches would be miracle enough for Godfrey, but he did not say that to the Duke. I would walk through the gates of hell itself if that's what it takes to find her, Godfrey said instead. Seeing as he was probably headed to hell anyway now. Sebastiano slumped into his seat. Pray it does not come to that, Sir Godfrey. 25. At this rate, we might have to ride to the Holy Land itself before we find a suitable quarry, Prince Magnus complained. The Crusaders have wiped out anything larger than a mouse. The other courtiers laughed, though it sounded forced, but Count Vesone did not. Prince Magnus might be a spoiled child who knew between little and nothing about hunting, but he was not wrong about this. Count Vesone's lands would take decades to recover from the ravenous host that had devoured everything in their path on their way to save the Holy Land. He only hoped the price he and others paid would be worth it. That Emperor Frederick and his army would return victorious. Anything else was unconscionable. Just the thought of Prince Magnus on the throne. I'm hungry. Count Vesone gestured for his servants to start laying out the midday meal. The teenage prince was annoying most of the time, but when he was hungry he was unbearable. Better men had met with hunting accidents in the past. Besides, there was little point to hunting in an empty forest. A forest that had fallen silent. For all Magnus's complaints there had been birds and rustlings from small creatures. But now there were none. A woman's scream rent the air, a shrill blast from her lungs followed by an equally piercing plea for help. Vesone leaped easily into the saddle while the other courtiers stood frozen, as though they'd never heard a woman scream before. If Magnus were truly to become emperor one day, he should have been the one to issue the command, but he was as slack-jawed as the rest. Come, we must help her. Vesone called as he rode in the direction he thought the voice had come from. As if to spur him on, she screamed again. Not waiting for the others to catch up, he urged his horse to speed up. He found them in a clearing, the very spot he'd hoped to reach for their midday meal. The man had the girl backed up against a tree, one hand around her neck, a knife in the other. Step away from the girl, Vesone commanded, laying his hand on his sword. The man glanced behind him, but his grip only tightened on the girl. This is no business of yours, sir. I'm merely teaching my wife a lesson in obedience, something she has been slow to learn, and we are here so that we will not disturb the neighbors with the noise." The knife came to the neckline of her gown, poised between her breasts. "Isn't that right, wife?" "I am no man's wife, least of all this piece of exiled scum," the girl said, baring her teeth. "I am Lady Penelope of Rialto, and he kidnapped me, knocked me unconscious, and dragged me here." His grip on her throat tightened, choking off her words and her air. Vesone expected her to claw at her throat, to get him to release her, as the bloodied scratches on his hand said she already had, but the girl surprised him. She grabbed for the knife, and succeeded in making him lower the blade, but not before it had sliced down the front of her gown. "I said step away from the girl." Vesone dismounted and drew his sword. He didn't know who to believe. If the man was right, it would take him very little time to discover the truth from whatever nearby village they'd come from, and he could do what he wished with his unwilling wife. If he was lying and the girl was telling the truth, justice must be served. The girl kicked him in the shins, forcing him to loosen his grip on her as he stumbled back. "I demand justice," she said. "This man is Leonardo Gabrielli, exiled from Rialto by my father, the Duke of Rialto. For crimes so numerous and vile, death was deemed too good for him. For daring to enter the Rialto lagoon, his punishment is instant death, and I demand immediate justice from the lord of these lands." A whistle sounded from behind Vesone. Magnus and the others had finally joined him, and the young prince's eyes were fixed on Lady Penelope. And no wonder, for Gabrielle's blade had slashed her gown open to the waist, baring her breasts and the red line of trickling blood between them. Perfect breasts heaving as her eyes fixed firmly on Vesone. Demanding his assistance, as any lady of her breeding would. "Lying whore!" Gabrielle hissed, raising his fist to strike her. Vesone didn't hesitate. He thrust his sword between the two, so Gabrielle's blow landed on the blade, cleaving his arm open to the bone. Gabrielle howled, turning his knife on Vesone instead. An arrow sprouted from Gabrielle's throat. Gurgling, the man clawed at it, before falling to his knees. His eyes burned at Vesone, blaming him for his impending death, before the light in them died and he toppled over at Lady Penelope's feet. She looked down with distaste, and only then did she notice her own nakedness. She tried to pull her torn gown up to cover her breasts, no longer the lady in charge. Now she looked like a frightened girl as her eyes met Vesone's again. "I call it a successful hunt, after all," Magnus cried, holding his bow high over his head in triumph. "I claim the kill and the prize." Lady Penelope gave a delicate shudder, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Magnus meant to claim her as his prize, Vesone realized in disgust. Vesone unfastened his cloak and wrapped it around Lady Penelope. "Come, my lady. I am Count Vesone, and these are my lands. Now that justice is done, please accept my hospitality and the services of my healer." She hesitated a moment, then gave him her hand, and allowed him to help her onto his horse. She sat at the back of the saddle, not touching the stirrups or the reins. As though she had no idea how to ride a horse. Or had Gabrielle injured her worse than he'd thought? By all that was holy, how did he ask a lady to speak of unspeakable things? She managed a timid smile. "Thank you for such timely action, Count Vesone. If you had not intervened, I fear that brute would have had his way with me. He was a magician, possessed of diabolical powers that could bring things to life. He rode on that wooden horse, using his magic to make it move." She pointed at a life-sized carving of a horse. Though it stood in the middle of the clearing, he hadn't noticed it until now. "Then it shouldn't be left here, for anyone to find." "Not if it is tainted by dark magic," Vesone said, beckoning for a servant to come forward. He left orders for the carving to be brought into his castle, where it was to be locked in a dungeon. Just in case. He eyed Lady Penelope, averting his gaze from the pouting prince who couldn't keep his eyes off the injured girl. She would need an escort, for if she lost too much blood, she might fall from the saddle. As if reading his thoughts, the girl swayed, appearing pained. Continue the hunt. I will take Lady Penelope home to find a healer, Veson said. He mounted the horse before her. Hold on to me, my lady. 26. Count Vazwan's castle was like something out of a story. A square stone building, several stories high, with a tower keep stuck to one side, soaring above it. The tower occupied his thoughts too, for that's where he planned to put her. For her safety, he told himself repeatedly, as he planned to place guards on the level below hers, and perhaps the stairs as well. The Count was true to his word, shouting for a healer as he helped her down from his horse. Can you walk? He asked anxiously, already stretching his arms out to carry her. Her wounds stung, especially where her clothes clung to them, but the cuts were shallow enough. She could climb the spiral stair to the top of the tower. Better than being carried up 'em, for all the Count's gallantry. I can, she said softly, pressing a hand to her chest as if it pained her. He fancied himself her honorable protector, and it cost her nothing to feign weakness. She was aching, tired, in need of a bath and a good night's sleep, and she had no idea how to get home without his help. He would help too, he was no twisty business courtier, to simper and smile while debating how best to kill her. Nor was he a gold-driven Rialto merchant lord, trying to work out the best way to profit from the situation. He led the way up the tower stairs, pausing occasionally to make sure she followed. This was the original keep, built by my ancestors in the time of Charles the Great. My great-grandfather had the second castle built, and he pledged to build a cloister on his land too. Construction took longer than he expected, and for a time the nuns stayed here in the tower until the cloister was finished. From one convent to another, Penelope thought. She was destined to die an old maid, just like Marco the fake fortune-teller said. Veson caught her frown. It fell into disuse until my father died, and my widowed mother decided to take the tower room for her own. She has been gone these 10 years, but the servants keep it as she left it, a chamber befitting their dowager countess, for she was well loved. There will be clothes and all the things a lady needs there. You may take whatever you wish. If anything is not to your liking, I will make arrangements to improve it for you, for you cannot travel until your wounds have healed. And it would take time to assemble a suitably large guard to protect her on her journey home to Rialto, if indeed she was who she said, he added in his head. Penelope nodded. Every step higher became more and more of an effort. If she'd known there would be so many steps, maybe she would have allowed the Count to carry her. Now she just hoped the climb would soon end so that she might rest. When she reached the top, the brightness in the room dazzled her, forcing her to stop. She blinked, bringing into focus the windows letting in so much light. They were made of horn, much like the ones she'd had at home, but cut into a delicate diamond pattern. It's beautiful, she breathed. Veson bowed. I'm sure you wish to rest. When the healer arrives, I'll see that she is sent to you immediately. He departed before she could respond, but Penelope was too busy examining her new quarters to notice. The dowager countess had been a weaver too, judging by the loom placed in the brightest part of the room. Chests around the walls held linens, silks and wool in myriad colors, all waiting to be woven into something new. A small chest at the end of the narrow bed held what remained of the woman's clothes, all in mourning black and grey. Penelope grimaced. She had no intention of mourning the magician, but she'd prefer even grey garments to ones stained with blood. There was water in the jug, so she decided to wash while she waited for the healer. Off came the Count's cloak, but her own clothes were another matter. Her torn gown and chemise had stuck to her wounds as the blood clotted, and she hissed with pain as she pulled them free. Her cuts started bleeding anew as her shredded bodice settled over her skirt, like some horrible parody of Marzia's wedding lace. The blood-stained washwater trickling down to turn it red did not help matters. Oh, don't do that, dear. Let me clean those cuts properly, a new voice said. Only now aware that she was bare to the waist, Penelope lifted her arms to cover her breasts from the newcomer's sight. The middle-aged woman made a clucking sound in her throat. Healers see plenty of skin, dear. Let's get you out of that ruined gown and onto the bed, so I can tend you. Penelope took a moment to skim through the woman's thoughts to determine that she truly was a healer, before she stretched out on the bed. A blissful sigh escaped her at the much-needed softness. The healer set to work, unpacking her satchel on the table. You're a lucky one. If this cut had gone any lower and just a little deeper, it would have opened your belly, and you would not have lived this long, the healer said as she worked. Some of her ministrations stung, but Penelope gritted her teeth and wished the ordeal to be over. But without you the future won't work, so I suppose even fate has her favorites. Can't kill the loom you're weaving on, the healer continued. What? Penelope blurted out. Her head felt clear, but the healer's words made her brain feel fuzzy all over again. The healer shot her a sharp glance. Empires rise and fall, and only a select few will ever know why. You have the power to make peace between emperors and kings, Lady of Rialto. But power calls to power, so you will give the world 5 powerful queens, though you will never take the throne for your own. How? Penelope began, reaching for the woman's thoughts. A jumble of images waited for her. Her own face, but older, never alone. A dark-haired woman, her skin tinted faintly blue as if underwater. A girl surrounded by fire, battling a dragon. A blonde teenager holding a thorny rose, heedless of the blood trickling down her hands. A fair girl with red-rimmed eyes, eyes that reflected fire both without and within. A redhead across the water, an army breaking like waves at her feet. And herself as she was now, hair flying in the wind, as she flew the enchanted horse high above 3 armies, marching on Rialto. You're a seer. The healer inclined her head. Yes, and I've been seeing visions of you for as long as I can remember. You're younger than I thought you'd be. I'd wager you haven't even bedded that handsome husband of yours yet. She winked. I will marry after all? Hope rose in Penelope's breast. Are you sure? The healer chuckled. Nothing is certain in a seer's visions, for your gift has shown them to you as surely as mine has given them to me. But when the fate of empires rests on you choosing wisely, I can say with certainty that one of the queens will be the daughter of your union with the man you love. She blinked. Or will love if you don't yet. Who? I'm only a seer. I see the future, not the secrets of your heart. That's your gift, dear. The healer patted her shoulder. If you put on a clean shift, I'll take these rags away for you, for I've done all I can for you now. Rest, recover, and when you're ready, the opportunity to leave will come. Your fate lies far from here, over the water. And with that, the healer left. Wait, I don't even know your name. Penelope called after the woman. You may call me Mistress Dahlia, though I doubt we'll meet again. Have courage, Lady Penelope, and keep busy. 27. I don't care what promises you made. You are nothing without my father, and in his absence, I am the highest authority here. I will have her. At first, Penelope, though the petulant cry belonged to a woman, but a quick peep into the spoiled brat's thoughts revealed it to be the boy she'd seen yesterday. The one who'd been so overwhelmed with desire at the sight of her bare breasts, desire that had reached fever pitch when blood welled, and he'd killed the magician to get to her. Without the Count's quick thinking to cover her and spirit her away, heaven only knew what the boy would do. She is Lady Penelope of Rialto, the Duke of Rialto's daughter. If you have her against his will, you will start a war. An attack on her person is an attack on Rialto itself, and not something those merchants will take lightly. But I want her, the boy whined. She's only a duke's daughter. No one would know. Rialto has no king. No emperor. They are ruled by a duke who happens to be her father. As far as Rialto and the rest of the world is concerned, that girl is a princess at the very least. The man who kidnapped her, there will be pursuit. Even now, Rialto's armies will be searching for her. If they find out she was here and came to harm, they will have no mercy. I will send a letter to her father tonight, telling him she has been found, safe and well, asking how we might best return her home. For if we do not and she is found here, all our lives will be forfeit. Then fetch a priest, I'll marry her and bed her right away. What God has joined no man may sunder. Ugh! Penelope shuddered at the image in the boy's head, of her own naked body, bloodied as if from a battle, thrown down on the ground as he had his way with her. If her father finds out she has been forced into a marriage not of his making, he'll sunder plenty. Starting with separating your head from your body. Please reconsider, Your Highness. Your father would never forgive me for starting a war or being responsible for the death of his favorite son. The prince's pride nearly exploded at the count's glib lie. Then send the letter to her father. Tell him the emperor's favorite son wishes to marry her. Relief flooded through Vesone. I will, Your Highness. Good. Now take me to her. I want to tell her myself. Another lie. What the prince wanted was to see her naked again, and he hoped to catch her undressed, at the mercy of a healer. But she has been through a terrible ordeal, Your Highness. I fear if we disturb her before she is properly recovered, it may cause irreparable harm. Don't be silly, Vesone. She's going to marry me. That's the best news she could ever hear. I have no doubt it will put her in the best spirits. Penelope wanted to laugh at the prospect of sharing a bed with that bloodthirsty toad. Better than the vipers of Bizzes, but not by much. I'll even honor her with a kiss. Could she endure kissing a toad without throwing up? She suspected she was about to find out, as she heard the sound of feet on the spiral stair. She glanced around, wishing she had something she might use as a weapon to defend herself. But she was no warrior, she was a weaver. Which in this room might be enough. Penelope placed herself behind the loom. A distaff sat propped against the wall within easy reach, and the unusually large shuttle would work in a pinch. Why, this one might do double duty as a rolling pin in the kitchens. A formidable weapon indeed, if she had the strength to wield it. And if she didn't? She sank onto the stool, her knees no longer willing to hold her. So much for the healer wishing her courage, for hers had fled through some tiny gap in the horn windows. The boy appeared in the doorway, closely followed by Count Vesone. Lady Penelope of Rialto, may I present Prince Magnus, son of His Imperial Majesty? Vesone said. Bloodlust burned in the prince's eyes until his gaze fell upon her modest grey gown. Then fury replaced it. What is she doing here? He waved his hand up and down. And why is she wearing that? Vesone bowed as low as he could. My deepest apologies for the interruption, Lady Penelope. His Highness commanded me to take him to you, and as I have always been His Imperial Majesty's loyal servant. If he'd refused, the prince would have demanded his head. The prince did not understand that, as the Duke of Rialto's daughter, she was the prince's equal, if not his better, for Emperor Frederick was not fool enough to make an enemy of Rialto. Only a queen could cow the prince. So a queen she must be. Penelope inclined her head, not bothering to rise. Thank you, Count Vesone. He looks like a fine boy. I'm sure Emperor Frederick is very proud. She forced herself to lower her gaze to the empty loom. She picked up the shuttle and pretended to go back to her weaving. This only angered the prince even more. Stop that, the prince insisted, striding forward. He reached for the spindle. Without thinking, she wrapped the spindle across his fingers. Don't touch my work. You'll ruin it. His eyes widened in fear as he stuck his stinging fingers in his mouth. Then he looked at the loom. There's nothing there. Of course he was right. She hadn't even strung the warp threads on the loom, let alone begun weaving properly. A ridiculous tale of her mother's came to mind, and she said, "Just because you cannot see it does not mean it's not there." Rialto weavers are among the finest in the world, and Rialto lace so fine that it is almost invisible to the common eye. If he'd heard the same tale, he'd challenged the lie at once, but it seemed the prince had not. He was too busy pouting at being struck, and plotting how he would have his revenge when they were married. "Keep weaving then. When you are well, I want to see you wearing a gown made of this on our wedding day." The prince turned and trotted down the steps. All the way down, wondering whether the fabric on the loom was real or if she'd gone mad. Only a mad woman would dare strike a prince, who knew what else she might do. The wedding would have to wait until the count's healer had cured her madness, for he would not tolerate being struck again. Vesown stared mournfully at her as if he wanted to say something, but could not form the words. He thought her mad too. If madness might buy her time, then mad she would be. "How do you like my Rialto lace, Count Vesown?" Penelope asked, gesturing at her empty loom. "Is the color too bright, or should I add more of that gold silk to it? I'm sure I saw some." She moved to the nearest chest and began rifling through it, looking for the imaginary gold thread. With her back turned, she should not have seen him poke a finger, then his whole hand through where the cloth should be. But of course she saw all that in the count's mind, and more. "Get well, Lady Penelope," he muttered, as he hurried down after the prince. To write a letter telling her father she'd lost her wits, and to send someone to collect her soon. There was gold thread here, skeins of the stuff. While she waited, she might weave something real as well. Heaven forbid that she should wear a widow's mourning clothes when her father's men showed up. No, she wanted to wear the brightest colors imaginable on that joyful day. 28. Godfrey had lost count of the days he'd been riding north, not to mention the tiny inns where he'd spent the night. They all seemed the same, with watery ale, thin stew with more vegetables than meat, and beds with mattresses worn so thin it was a wonder he slept at all. "I have a tale that can top them all," a newcomer boasted, slapping both hands on the bar. "Keep my cup filled with ale all night, and I will tell you everything." Judging by the excitement this caused in the small country inn, Godfrey suspected news had been hard to come by of late. A pile of coins formed on the bar, enough to buy the man a meal as well as enough ale to see him sleep for days, no matter what mattress he lay upon. The innkeeper dipped a mug into the ale barrel and set it before the storyteller. The newcomer took a deep breath. "Now every man here has heard of the Holy Crusade our Imperial Majesty, Emperor Frederick, is on, right? Him and 2 of his sons, while the oldest stayed at home to rule in his father's place. The younger boys all got fostered out across the kingdom. One of the princes, he got sent to a castle not far from here. It belongs to the Count of Vesown." The storyteller paused to drink the health of the count he served before continuing. "One day, the count takes the young prince hunting. They go deep into the woods, far from any road or town where no one goes. And they hear a woman scream. A woman where there should be no one. So they ride deeper into the forest to find her. When they do, they are just in time to save her from a terrible rogue who has stolen her away, and means to steal her virtue too." He drained his ale, then waited for a refill. The girl is fair fainting from fear, but the count manages to revive her, and asks for her tale. How she came to that place, and who she and her attacker were. The storyteller slapped his hands on the bar. "Who do you think she was?" Various men shouted names, from their favorite whore right up to queens from legend. He shook his head, laughing at them all. "She said the man was a magician, who flew her from her home on a magic horse. Then she said she was the Duke of Rialto's daughter, the highest lady in that land. The count, being the wise man that he is, believed her at once, for such was obvious from her noble bearing, and offered her the hospitality of his home." Again, the assembled men toasted the count's health. Godfrey's grip tightened on his cup, as he willed the storyteller to continue. Ah, but the prince, do not forget the young prince. Not yet a man, but near enough to know a beautiful woman when he sees one. And she was, the most beautiful girl there ever was seen, dazzling the poor prince, who fell instantly in love with the girl. There was some laughter at this. They had never seen her, Godfrey had to remind himself. She would enchant most men, if it truly was Penelope. Sadly, she fainted again before she could fall in love with him, and they carried her to the count's castle. A healer came to see to the girl, and said she would live. The prince was delighted, and sat by her bedside, day and night, waiting for his beloved to wake up. Anger burned in Godfrey's gut. The boy might be a prince, but how dare he remain in Penelope's bedchamber while she slept? She would be horrified if she knew. It was some time before she awoke, this beautiful lady, and she beheld her prince, her rescuer. The prince fell to his knees, overcome with her beauty once more, as he beseeched her to marry him. Another pause as the storyteller drained his ale. One man congratulated him on a good story, hoping the prince would be happy. The storyteller nearly choked at this, and the tap room fell silent. Happy? The prince? Oh, the story is not over yet. For the damsel in distress, the sweet maiden who had swooned in his arms, was a completely new creature upon waking. As though possessed of the devil himself, she attacked the prince so violently that he feared for his life, and fled her chamber. The count was forced to lock the girl in the top room of the tower, so that she could not hurt anyone in her madness. No. Penelope would not threaten a man's life. She might throw an orange at him, but want to kill him? Godfrey could not believe it of her. This girl must be someone else, pretending to be Penelope. The storyteller brandished a scroll case. The count has sent me with a letter to the Duke of Rialto, asking him to send someone to fetch his mad daughter. But the prince, oh the poor prince. The prince wants the duke's permission to marry the girl, mad or no, and offers a reward to the man who can cure the girl's madness. To the man who can lift the curse from her, for it is the magician's curse I have no doubt, likely whispered with his last breath as he lay dying, the prince will give a bag of gold and his sister's hand in marriage. Cheers erupted as the patrons drank to the health of the prince, the storyteller and the promised princess. Godfrey had to wait until the crowd around the storyteller had dispersed, before he dared approach the man. When the storyteller turned to head up the stairs to the room he'd undoubtedly secured for the night, Godfrey made his move. "Is that sailor's tale you told true, man?" he asked. The storyteller turned around, narrowing his eyes. He'd had several mugs of ale, but not enough to be drunk, Godfrey judged. "I swear it on my life," the storyteller said. "Imprisoning Penelope. Did the count truly lock her in a prison?" "In a tower," the storyteller corrected. "The Dowager Countess's bower, in fact. Not a prison at all, but where the count's late mother did her weaving and sewing. Far superior to any other sleeping chamber in the castle proper. The prince still means to marry her when someone lifts the madness. In the meantime she can be heard, working on the Dowager Countess's loom. It is the only thing that calms her." Penelope had mentioned her affinity for weaving and sewing. Perhaps. Godfrey held up a silver coin, more money than the inn patrons had laid on the bar, much of which had ended in the storyteller's pockets. "Tell me her name." The storyteller eyed the coin. "I cannot quite recall. It was a long name, a name from legend. Panacea. No, that's not right. Persephone? No, I remember now. It was Penelope." His throat suddenly too dry to speak, Godfrey handed over the coin and dismissed the man. He'd found her. When the sun's first rays touched the earth the next day, Godfrey was already well on his way north to Vesone. To save Penelope from princes, counts, and whatever curse the magician had cast. 29. Word had spread of her supposed madness. Servants tiptoed in and out of her chamber, fearful of her notice. Penelope longed to say something that would dispel the miasma of fear that surrounded her, but she didn't dare. Fear was the only thing that kept the prince away, though more than once she'd heard him climb the stairs to peep through the keyhole to her chamber. Hoping to catch her in a state of undress, she knew. The next time a servant came, she'd complained about the door's eyes staring at her and demanded a screen to hide her from view. The poor maid had nearly flown down the steps, but the screen had arrived soon after, to the prince's endless muttered frustration. The loom was a good one, and she wove until she ran out of gold silk. It was not enough to make a whole gown, so she searched through the chests for more. The dowager countess had left enough supplies to make a lifetime of clothing, but she hadn't liked gold thread much. Or maybe she had, and she'd used it all. She'd also liked weaving green wool with swathes of cloth filling 3 chests. Perhaps Penelope should make a gown from the already woven wool, to wear while she wove something brighter than the dark green the countess had favored. She started to spread the cloth out, measuring it with her eyes. There might be enough for one gown and half enough again for a cloak to match, but it would be best to do the cloak entirely in dark green. Then she might melt into the forest, and no one would see her. Which she would not do until she had no other option. Penelope dug through the chest, lifting aside a bundle of black wool to find more green. Yet this cloth was not the same as the rest. Soft like felt yet gleaming like silk. If she'd been asked, she would have described it as short fur, if any creature alive had moss-green fur. Yet the stuff had clearly been woven on a loom of some sort. She laid it out atop the wool. Enough for a gown, and she could trim it with the gold silk. She would keep the scraps of the green stuff though, in the hope that she might manage to replicate such strange cloth. The green wool would become a cloak then, for this stuff shimmered too much when it caught the light. She would cut and sew the gown and the cloak in secret, hiding them when she heard the thoughts of anyone climbing the stairs. When they reached her room, they would find her seated at the loom, weaving the invisible Rialto lace that made them all think she was mad. What she would give to see real Rialto lace again. To feel the stuff under her fingers as she'd fashioned it into a wedding dress for Marcia, Penelope wiped away a tear that had appeared inexplicably on her cheek. She would go home. It might take all her courage and fortitude and endurance and many other virtues she wasn't sure she possessed, but Count Vesone had written to her father, and her father would send someone to escort her home if he could not come himself. When she saw him again, she would wear a green cloak, over a green and gold gown made of the mysterious cloth. Ready to give the world, was it 5 queens? And bring 2 emperors to heal her. One woman, a weaver, who would be happy to spend the rest of her life simply creating clothing. Perhaps that was it, she would clothe 5 queens in such magnificence that men swooned and lost their hearts to them. Even emperors were men too, with all the urges of the flesh. But these mysterious queens must wait, for her own gown came first. Yes, the gown, then the cloak. Decision made, she set to work. 30. Veswane's castle was much like his father's, Godfrey mused. Sitting on a hill at a distance from the town, but Veswane's tower was part of the castle, not on a neighboring, higher hill like his father's. A tower where the Count kept Penelope, if his messenger was to be believed. He squinted at the tower windows, hoping for a glimpse of her, but they were all shuttered. Never mind. If his plan worked, he would see her soon enough. He'd sold his horse at the last town, covering his armor with a coarse robe like those worn by the Benedictine monks. Nobody at this town paid him any attention as he headed past the inn, toward the monastery on the edge of town. "I'm Brother Eudes, a mendicant friar from St. Angelo of Concordia," he told the first monk he met. "My abbot told me to travel here, for he was told in a dream that my healing skills were sorely needed." The monk frowned. "We have a good healer here already, who can cure many an illness. You may stay for a night if the abbot agrees, but your own superior must be mistaken." Godfrey lowered his voice. "My abbot is never mistaken, and I know he is not now. On the road, I heard tell of a terrible affliction that has befallen someone at the castle. I am no ordinary healer. God has blessed me with the miracle of being able to cure madness." He prayed he would be forgiven for the lie. Though it would not be entirely a lie if he could restore Penelope to her sane self. If such a thing was even necessary. The monk nodded. "I will take you to the abbot. Father Danilo will know what to do." Father Danilo and the abbot were one and the same, so Godfrey only had to repeat his tale once, adding details about Saint Angelo until the man seemed satisfied. The priest was only too willing to take him up to the castle, for he confided, "Count Vesone is very worried for the young woman. He feels responsible for not protecting her properly, and is willing to do anything within his power to be able to return her to her father, healed." No more than Godfrey himself. He hoped the priest's assessment of the count was indeed accurate. The priest took him to the great hall, where a servant promised to tell the count of his arrival, before begging the priest to pay a visit to the servant's mother, who lay dying in her bed. Godfrey waved the priest away. "Go see to the poor woman's soul. I can meet with the count alone." The servant thanked them both profusely, beckoning Godfrey to follow him up to his master's sola, because, "I can see you are a holy man of God, and I will vouch for your goodness myself." Feeling more uncomfortable by the minute, Godfrey followed the man upstairs. "My lord, this is Friar Eudes, who Father Danilo assures me is an expert in matters of madness and possession." "Send him in." The servant waved Godfrey into the room, then shut the door behind him. The silver-haired man dressed in plain wool might have been the castle steward, not its master, but the vair collar on his cloak gave away his high station. "Do you believe I gave the devil leave to take lodging in my home, friar?" Godfrey considered for a moment, then replied, "I believe the devil is a tricky beast, one which may hide its true nature in order to steal souls it does not deserve. I have seen madness from other sources too. Sometimes a curse can make men behave contrary to their natures. I would need to see the patient for myself before I could give you an honest answer to your question, my lord." The count nodded. "Very well. I'll take you to her." Part of Godfrey wanted to tell the count to wait, but the rest of him was simply too eager to see Penelope again. If it was Penelope! He fairly flew up the stairs to reach her, stopping only when they reached the closed door at the top. Count Vesone rapped on it 3 times. "Lady Penelope, may I enter?" That voice. "Yes, of course, Count Vesone." Godfrey nearly fell to his knees to thank heaven and all their saints for their help in finding her. Not least of all Saint Eudes, patron saint of hopeless causes. But he remembered himself, and hoped the count didn't notice. "Are you coming, friar?" Vesone asked in a low voice. Godfrey swallowed. "I will stay here and observe unseen. If the devil sees me, he will surely recognize me and perhaps set the poor girl upon me, where she might be hurt." The count nodded. "Very well." He strode into the room and asked Penelope about her weaving. Godfrey edged into the room, placing himself behind a large screen that presumably blocked drafts from the door, and looked his fill. She was dressed in dove grey, which made her brilliant hair stand out all the more. She kept her eyes down on her loom as she told Vesone about her work. A soft smile played about her lips, just as it had when she'd listened to Godfrey's stories. Perfect Penelope, showing no signs of madness or ill health. His prayers were answered. After a while the count finished his conversation and made to leave. Godfrey hustled out of the way before she saw him, for if she recognized him and called him by name, the count would know he had been tricked. When the door closed behind him, the count shook his head. "Madness has taken hold of her wits completely, I am afraid. She speaks of cloth that does not exist, yet to listen to her, one would believe she could see it. Is it the devil or a curse, friar? And more importantly, can you cure it?" "Cloth that did not exist?" There was a tale his uncle had once told him about such cloth. Cloth sold by a greedy Rialto merchant to a particularly prideful emperor. A pretense, so that those who knew the merchant might see the emperor as he truly was. Penelope could be feigning madness, but why would she do so? He needed to speak to her alone. Godfrey deepened his frown. I am not certain. I must know more. Tell me, how often does she attend church? Never. Why, she has not even been to confession, though it is Lent. Godfrey nodded thoughtfully. See that she attends confession tomorrow. With Father Danilo's help, I will prepare a trap for the devil, if indeed there is a devil, and force the beast out of her. It was the Count's turn to frown. And if you cannot? Pray that I can, my lord. 31. The Count says you must dress for church, milady, and prepare for confession, the maid told her when she brought Penelope's breakfast. Oh, how many sins she would have to confess! Or was that conceal? Feigning madness, striking a prince, wishing the prince would choke on his dinner and die, her satisfaction at the magician's death. The list was long, and not one she cared to confess to a priest who might tell all of it to Vesone. She chose to wear the green gown trimmed with gold, as she'd finished sewing it only yesterday. No one but she and the maid would see it, though, for she left the tower shrouded in one of the dowager's dark mourning cloaks. Half a dozen of Veswane's men surrounded her to shepherd her into town. Not to the church, but the monastery. None of the men seemed to know why, for their minds were filled with more questions than her own. They left her at the door, where she was escorted by a single monk to the refectory. She almost told him she had no need for an escort, for this building was the twin of St. Angelo. She'd heard a tale that St. Angelo had originally been built for monks, who had given it to their sisters when a more suitable site, closer to the city, had been gifted to the community. Now she saw the truth of it. Yet this refectory had one item that the one at St. Angelo did not, an ornately carved confessional, where lay people might confess their sins to the priests in the community, and receive absolution at the hands of these holy men. The monk opened the door for her, and then closed it when she was inside. Trapped inside a tiny box, barely big enough for one person, there was a good reason why she only endured this once a year. The priest was no less fearful as he entered his own wooden cell. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been close to a year since my last confession, she began, wondering what to say next. Tell me your sins, child, the priest prompted. The priest's fear increased, and Penelope took a moment to work out why. She almost laughed when she realized he was frightened of her. Well, not her exactly, but the demon he believed possessed her, driving her to madness. And he had some sort of plan to rid her of the creature, a plan that involved both the Count and a newcomer to the community, a holy man whose business was disposing of demons. Child, the priest repeated. Penelope shook her head. If the priest meant to hand her over for the ministrations of some quack, she fully intended to make him question his own conscience too. My greatest sin is overwhelming fear, Father. Fear that the plan in place for me will be more than I can bear. Fear that I may never go home again. Fear that I will be held prisoner here. I fear every day, Father, that those who profess to help me do not have my best interests at heart, and that I am wrong to have faith in them and their plans for me. Even Dahlia the seer expected too much of her. She was one woman, how could she be the one to make kingdoms rise and fall? Elevate not one but 5 queens? You must have faith, child, in God's plan and no other. He thought she referred to the demon and its plans, not his own. Or hers. I fear I have lost my faith, Father. And I know not where to find it. He seemed satisfied with this response. Then that will be your penance. You will pray until your faith once again finds you. No, that didn't make sense. But Father. The door to her cell opened, and a strong hand grasped hers. My brother will take you to my private chapel where you will remain in prayer until your faith is renewed, the priest said. No. Do not resist, my lady, and your prayers will be answered, along with my own. The words hung in the air, unspoken yet clear in her mind. She stared at the monk who held her hand. With his face hidden beneath his cowl, she could see nothing but the strong fingers that enveloped hers. Come with me, my lady. She wished she had the power to push her own thoughts into the minds of others, instead of the other way around. She would tell his man to stay out of her head and shove his prayers up his own arse. She bit down hard to stop the words from leaving her lips. The monk bowed his head in obedience, almost as if he'd heard her, and moved away, tugging her after him. Try as she might, she could not break free from his grip. She would be forced to follow him. He pulled her into a short passage, then kicked the door shut behind them. Only then did he tug off his cloak and drop it on the floor. Godfrey stood before her, grinning. Her mouth dropped open and no words came out. Please do not say you have lost faith in me, my lady. I have searched so long to find you. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. Not the tentative sort of kiss they'd shared in her father's house all those years ago, but something crafted out of all-consuming passion and fire that burned all her doubts away. Get me out of here, Godfrey, she begged, breathless. He pressed a finger to his lips and pulled her through the passage and down into the chapel proper. Candles sat on every surface, with filled candelabras forming a rough circle around the center of the floor. Someone had scrawled strange symbols on the flagstones in what looked like a mix of chalk and blood. Godfrey, what? He shook his head, his finger not leaving his lips. The priest is listening. He has never performed an exorcism before, and hopes to learn how by spying upon us. And the count sent his own spy, a young squire who hid behind the confessional, so that he might hear what you said. I know he has not gone far. The clear images in his mind illustrated the tale. Godfrey had mistaken Prince Magnus for a squire. What a blow to the boy's pride if he but knew. I have a plan, but in order for it to work, we will need the enchanted horse. Do you know where it is? Penelope shook her head. She hadn't seen it since the day the magician died. When blood had bubbled up from his mouth as he'd gasped for his last breath. Even closing her eyes could not shut the image out. Her lips sought Godfrey's so that she might lose herself in the warmth of his embrace. The warmth of his thoughts as he wrapped his arms around her before he pushed her up against a low wall of some sort, his body pressed against hers, the heat of them together more than she could bear, and yet she wanted to lean back, to open herself to him in every way possible, and he wanted to make love to her on the altar. By all that was holy, they could not do something so wicked. I did not know you could do that. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. I heard you, as clearly as if you'd spoken the words aloud. Just like when you said I should shove my prayers. Her cheeks flamed. Please forgive me. You may not have guessed, but I have attempted few quests, and I have not yet succeeded in completing any of them. I promised your father and you that I would bring you safely home, and I mean to do so. But if you do not know where the horse is. Penelope took a deep breath, then lifted her lips to his ear. The count has it. He had his servants bring it to the castle, but he locked it away, for he fears it. She felt the sigh gust out of him as relief relaxed his shoulders. Then all she could feel was his lips on hers as he whirled her around, incoherent with joy. Her heart swelled within her chest, sharing his joy, or expressing her own? Who could say? Reading the secrets of her heart was her gift. Dahlia's words washed over her, revealing the truth she had not known until now. It wasn't joy, or not just joy. Her heart swelled with love for Godfrey, the knight who would save her, whatever the cost. She bit her lip, tasting blood, then fixed her gaze on Godfrey's face. Do whatever you must to free me of this place. I trust you. He bowed deeply. I am honored by your trust, my lady. 32. His lips burned from her kisses. Though he knew he was not worthy of a single one, he had not been able to resist her. Nor had he wanted to. But when she'd said she trusted him, he knew her honor depended on him finding the fortitude to play the part he'd created for himself. So he did not allow his lips to linger on hers for another moment, no matter how he longed for her touch. He donned his hooded monk robe once more, willing her to trust him still as he scooped her up in his arms. She stared at him shocked. I am going to tell them I attempted an exorcism, but the demon fought so hard I feared it might kill you. You swooned and I will wait until you wake before I try again. Tomorrow. She nodded in understanding, then lay back in his arms in a most artful swoon. He would have given everything he owned to see her lying in his arms like this. Now he didn't want to let go. If you let go I shall fall, so I implore you do not let go. He could even hear her tart tone as though she'd spoken the words aloud. Never, my lady. If only she could be his lady. He half expected the guards waiting outside the monastery gates to take Penelope from him, but they kept a healthy distance from her as they surrounded him, and escorted them back to the castle. He carried her up the tower stairs and laid her on her bed, cloak, boots and all, wishing he dared to steal one more kiss, but he could feel the maid hovering behind him, waiting to tend to her mistress. He had to force himself to leave her chamber and close the door. The Count pounced on him. Is she healed? Lady Penelope was as perfect as the day he first met her, he wanted to say but did not dare, or all this would be for naught. Godfrey sighed deeply and hung his head. The devil within her is uncommonly strong. We fought long and hard until her delicate body could take no more, and she fell into a deep swoon. But before she did, the devil said he had been driven from his true vessel by a magician, and had been forced to possess the girl against his will. His true vessel was much larger, a sort of sinister, dark horse, also he said. He tried to appear puzzled. Have you ever seen such a thing? Or has the girl? Vesson slumped. Yes, there was a large wooden horse where we found her. I feared it was something dangerous, so I locked it in the dungeons. Godfrey forced himself to look surprised. So there is such a thing? Demons are so skilled at lying, I suspected there would not be, but if there is, we must take the chance. Both the girl and the demon will be weak for some days yet, so we should act quickly. Let her sleep now, but when she wakes, have her and the horse brought to the town square, along with all the incense you can find. Then I shall force the demon from her and into the horse before I burn it to ash. Vesson bowed deeply. If you succeed in curing her, you will have my gratitude and that of His Highness as well. As men of your order do not marry, perhaps a different reward will be offered. Godfrey shook his head. Freeing the maiden of this diabolical taint will be reward enough. Lies every word. He hoped the Count did not know it. You are truly a saint, the Count said. Oh, if only he knew. 33. My lady, you must wake. If you cannot walk, the master's men will carry you. Maybe even the prince himself. Little toad. The distasteful thought of the prince made Penelope open her eyes. She'd rather throw herself from the top window of the tower than let the prince get his hands on her. Especially after Godfrey's kisses yesterday, before he'd carried her in his arms. She wished she truly was the swooning type, so that she might sleep and dream of it all over again. But it was tomorrow, the morrow Godfrey had promised her, when he would take her home. She wore the green gown again and the cloak she'd made, with a pair of boots the dowager no longer needed. Just like yesterday, guards surrounded her for the short walk to town, but instead of the monastery, they took her to the town square where a number of bonfires had been prepared. They circled around the familiar figure of the Enchanted Horse. A number of townspeople stood in the square, asking whispered questions of one another. None seemed to know why there were bonfires or a horse until someone spotted her. "They're going to burn the devil out of that girl." She wasn't sure whether the man had spoken aloud or merely thought the words, but the statement spread like wildfire until everyone seemed to be staring at her in a mix of fear, excitement and dread. None of them had seen an exorcism before or a devil, but they were determined to witness this. As long as they didn't truly mean to burn her. Godfrey wouldn't do that. But if this wasn't his doing? Two guards pushed her into the circle and backed away from the woodpiles. She whirled, just in time to see the first bonfire kindle into flame. All around her, torches were thrust into the oil-soaked branches until they belched out smoke, rising up into the sky. She wanted to back away, but the fire blazed on all sides. There was nowhere to run. Her back hit something hard. The enchanted horse. She climbed onto its back, reaching for the nail that would draw her blood. "Please do not leave without me, my lady." Godfrey slid onto the horse's back behind her, wrapping both arms about her waist. The smoke was so thick she could not see the crowd, though she could hear their shouts. She and Godfrey rose up, level with the rooftops, then higher still, following the smoke that hid them until they reached the clouds. Safe. Free. Thank all that was holy, for her courage was spent. Penelope burst into tears, letting her fear drain out of her with the endless salt water. Somehow she turned to bury her face in Godfrey's tunic, and his arms around her were exactly the kind of comfort she needed. "Lady Penelope, with your permission, I would like to take you somewhere you will be safe, where you can rest, a stop along the way to taking you home to Rialto." It took her a moment to realize he'd spoken aloud. She swallowed, her throat dry and scratchy from the smoke. "Yes," she managed to say. She felt Godfrey reach forward over the horse's neck, heard his gasp as the nail drew blood. Then the horse turned beneath them, heading to the destination of his desire. As long as it had a bed and water to wash with, she would be happy, was her last coherent thought as she drowsed in his arms. 34. Lady Penelope was still asleep when the wooden horse landed in the courtyard outside Godfrey's father's castle. The place had not changed a bit, not that he'd expected it to. No servant came to see to his horse, but it wasn't as though this one needed feeding, grooming, or even rest. Penelope probably did though, so he took her up the servant's stair to Melisend's chamber. He did not dare undress her, but he took the liberty of removing her boots and unfastening her cloak, before laying it atop her for a coverlet. He left her there, where no one would disturb her, and went to wash and change into fresh clothes. Questioning the first servant he found, Godfrey discovered his father was at dinner in the great hall, and he hastened to join him. His father's booming laughter rang out. Godfrey tensed. His brothers must be home then. They would not be happy to see him, for surely father would have told them about his part in Melisend's death. Poor Melisande, he had failed her in life and now in death too, for he would never redeem her honor now. It was a miracle Penelope trusted him, given what a failure he'd been. Now he had to admit his failure to his father. Godfrey threw open the doors of the great hall and marched in. "Godfrey! Is that truly you? We thought you were dead." Godfrey bowed to his father. "No, by some miracle I still live and breathe, father." "It must be a miracle, for I just finished telling the Baron of Marischal how you died of your wounds, after you slew Sir Enguerrand and his companions." Godfrey blinked. At his father's right hand sat Zoticus, who had just said Enguerrand and the unholy trinity were dead. Along with he himself. The slightest nod from Zoticus confirmed his suspicions. All four were slain by Zoticus's hand. Which meant, Melisend's honor was restored. "So by what miracle are you here? When I saw you fall that final time I could have sworn you were dead, or I would not have told your father so," Zoticus said. It took him a moment to put Zoticus's words together in his head, and make sure his story matched. Godfrey managed a pained smile. "I thought so too, my friend, but it seems the world is not done with me yet. I woke up on a healer's cot on a ship, wishing I was dead, but most assuredly alive. When the ship landed in Rialto, I was well enough to pay my respects to the Duke, who sent me on a quest to recover his daughter." Godfrey accepted a cup of wine. "The lady is tired from her ordeal, so she is resting upstairs right now. We will continue our journey in the morning. And what of you, my friend? I thought you were intent on freeing the Holy Land." Zoticus shrugged. "It seems the Holy Land will be harder to free than we hoped it would be. A Seljuk army numbering in the millions swept down on us from out of nowhere, and slaughtered many of us where we stood. If it were not for your horse with her winged feet, I might not have made it through the battle, let alone back here to bring the news to your father of your successful quest to redeem your sister's honor." It took Godfrey a long moment to understand what the man had said. Luckily, he did not have to swallow his surprise, for there was more than enough news to astound anyone. "The crusade is over? And you brought Pegasus home?" Zoticus nodded. "Thank you." The words came out flat as Godfrey sat down, overwhelmed. "I am in your debt." Zoticus waved the debt away. "Nonsense. We are friends. Your horse saved my life. I brought her home. Debt repaid." Godfrey made polite conversation for a few more minutes before he found his eyelids sagging, threatening to put him to sleep. He excused himself and headed up to his own bedchamber. They would have a long way to go in the morning, but for now, both he and Penelope could sleep safely. And Melisend's soul might know repose too. 35. Penelope woke in a room with corners. Definitely not her tower room. "Are you awake, Your Highness?" She didn't recognize the curtsying maid, either. "Where am I?" Penelope asked. "Mistress Melisend's room, at the Baron of Marechal's castle. Sir Godfrey ordered me to attend you. I wasn't sure if you wanted to dress or break your fast first. I was only in training to be Mistress Melisend's maid. I never thought I might have the honor of serving a princess." She curtsied so low, she could have sat cross-legged on the floor. "I'm not a princess. I'm Lady Penelope of Rialto." The maid did not rise. "Sir Godfrey said the titles were different where you come from. That they do not call you a princess, yet princes beg for the honor of your hand. Forgive me if I offend you, Your Highness." It wasn't the maid's fault Godfrey had told her such things. "Where is Sir Godfrey now?" "With the horses, as always. I can send for him, if that is your wish." Penelope shook her head. "No. Help me dress, then take me to him." The maid agonized over the gowns that had once belonged to Mistress Melisende, none of which she thought was good enough for a princess, until Penelope pointed at one in pale blue wool and insisted upon it. She almost regretted her choice when the maid laced it up over her chemise, for it was obvious that Melisende had been much narrower in the chest than Penelope. As it was, the lacing pushed her breasts up and out, like the bawdiest tavern whore. Only by fastening her chemise close about her throat could Penelope manage any kind of modesty. The maid slid silk hose up her legs while Penelope braided her own hair. She felt the maid's disappointment at not being able to try out what she imagined were court fashions, which was quickly eclipsed with horror as Penelope donned the dowager's boots she'd arrived in, but the girl did not say anything aloud. Penelope hoped the girl might one day meet a real princess, who would undoubtedly fulfill all her dreams of grandeur. Penelope herself would never be royalty, had the seer not said so. The thought was more freeing than she'd thought it would be. The maid led the way outside the castle walls where Fields held. What was the name of a group of horses? Was it a herd? She wasn't sure, but there sure were a lot of them. prancing, dancing and galloping about, their hooves making the most thunderous sounds as they hit the turf. So wild. She backed away from the energetic beasts, only to feel something warm and solid stop her retreat. Something blew a gust of wind down her shift from high above, and she shrieked. "Easy, Pegasus. This is Lady Penelope, and I'm sure she doesn't appreciate you blowing your breakfast down the front of her gown." There was straw caught in her lacings. Now she not only felt like a tavern whore, but one who'd taken a tumble in the hay. And here was Godfrey, holding the bridle of the most enormous white horse, beaming at her as though he had no idea what she was thinking. "My sister would be green with envy if she ever saw how well that gown fits you. You look breathtaking as always, my lady." Godfrey bowed. From another man it might have been empty flattery. From him it was the honest truth. "Would you like to join me for a ride?" He gestured at the field of frolicking horses. "Pegasus here is the fastest and my favorite, but you may choose any of them you wish. That bay over there will be sent to Emperor Frederick, once the beast is gelded and trained, and the king in Casmiris has laid claim to the next colt Pegasus produces. We don't sell breeding stock, only geldings, but the offers we've had for even a single Marischal mare, it's more money than I've ever seen, that's for sure. But father will not budge. With the exception of Pegasus, none of the mares leave Marischal. And no one rides them but our family and those who work for us." Hysterical laughter bubbled out of her. "Are you offering me a job, riding these capricious beasts I cannot even imagine how to control? I'd sooner go back to my tower than climb on the back of a beast with a mind of its own, and hooves that could crush my head." She turned and hurried back to the safety of the castle. "Penelope! Penelope, wait!" If she turned around, she'd see those huge horses again. And the incredulous look on Godfrey's face. She did not want to hear his thoughts at that moment, his contempt at her fear of horses. "Lady Penelope, have you never ridden a horse before?" "Not once?" She stopped, not sure how to admit her shame. "Of course there are no roads in Rialto, and horses cannot walk on water. But I never imagined." Godfrey paused. "Lady Penelope, would you do me the honor of allowing me to take you for your first horse ride? I promise to keep you safe. If any horse here should even think of harming you, I will see the beast butchered for the table before day's end." She'd left whatever courage she possessed in that smoky town square yesterday. "No." She shied away from his outstretched hand. "Not even if we ride double, as we did on the Enchanted Horse? I would never let you fall, Penelope." She swallowed. She knew every word was the truth, but emperors and kings would envy you, for this is an offer I have never made to anyone else. One ride on the finest horse in the world. First around the field and then, if you like, a bit longer. I would not offer if I didn't think you would enjoy it. Oh, how could she refuse? He had done so much for her, and all he wanted was to share a simple pleasure that was the greatest gift he thought he could offer. He grinned as if she'd spoken into his mind. Perhaps she had. Godfrey swung up into the horse's saddle, and held out his arms to help her up. By all that was holy! She landed in his lap. He wasn't wearing armor today, but he didn't feel any less hard behind her or beneath her. "Shouldn't I be sitting behind you? I thought that's what ladies do in stories about knights." Godfrey burst out laughing. "If we're ever riding into a battle and I'm wearing armor, then you can sit behind me, while I shield you. But if you're going to learn to ride today, you'll need to be the one in front, holding the reins. You're the knight in training, which I guess makes me the lady." She had to laugh at that. Just the thought of Godfrey in a gown. Godfrey reached around her, his arms warm at her waist. "Now hold the reins like this and nudge the horse with your knees like this." The horse set off at a slow walk. Godfrey showed her how to persuade the horse to turn when they reached a corner of the field, but she suspected this one would have turned anyway. They made it back to their starting point without any mishaps, and she dared to relax. "More?" Godfrey asked. She swallowed and nodded. "I'll take you on Pegasus's favorite trail," Godfrey said, steering the horse away from the castle. "No need to tell her what to do here, she knows the way. All you'll have to do is hang on." He leaned forward, pushing her down against the horse's neck. For a moment, she resisted. "Be easy and lean into it," he murmured into her ear. "Read the horse's mind if you will not read mine, and do what I do." She relented, letting her body move with his and the horse. It was almost soothing, the slow lumbering gait. "Go," Godfrey breathed. The horse burst into flight, in a flurry of thundering hooves and rushing wind and Godfrey's laughter in her ear as he urged the horse on. Not that the beast needed the encouragement. For Penelope could feel the horse's mind too, a rush of exhilaration at running so fast. It was almost as though man and mare shared the same thought. A low stone wall approached at alarming speed. She felt muscles bunch, tighten, and all three of them went soaring over the top of it, with barely a pause in the mare's stride. She heard a whooping sound, and it took a moment to realize it came from her own mouth. She could feel Godfrey laughing behind her, and she laughed right along with him. The wooden horse had never felt anywhere near as fast or as exciting as this. When the horse felt she'd galloped enough, she started to slow down. By the time they reached the river, Penelope thought she could have matched pace with her, walking beside her. But she had no desire to move from her current position, wedged firmly between the man she loved and his horse. Until the horse stopped beside the river and dropped her head for a drink. Only Godfrey's grip around her middle kept her from sliding into the river, face first. He swung her off the horse, then dismounted behind her. There was a question in his eyes, but his thoughts were so tangled, she wasn't sure which one he wanted answered. So she said, "Thank you. For the ride, for your patience, and for not giving up on me. I could not let a woman of your courage and your determination remain in fear of one of the gentlest, noblest creatures that ever lived," Godfrey said. "You've ridden a flying horse, and it didn't daunt you at all. I clung to its back for a good half-hour before I dared to open my eyes, and then I was so afraid of falling off I didn't dare move until it landed in your orchard. I've ridden real horses for as long as I can remember, and I was terrified of a wooden one." He ducked his head, not meeting her eyes. "I know. While you were telling me about it in the kitchen, I was watching the memories that flashed through your mind. Then you know I'm not much of a knight. Horses I can handle, but quests and swords and all the other things are not my strength." She smiled. "You saved me just fine. That makes you the finest knight I've ever known." Godfrey didn't agree, but he had the good manners not to say it aloud. "But a poor host, taking you riding before breakfast. I should take you and Pegasus home, so you can enjoy proper marital hospitality, and Pegasus can get a rub down." "Will Pegasus fly again?" she asked. Godfrey eyed the horse. "Not willingly. She prefers open fields to the road, and the road is the fastest way back." "Then will you be the knight this time, so I can experience being a lady?" Godfrey laughed. "Even if you donned my armor, brandished a sword, and rode Pegasus into battle, you would still be very much a lady. A lady who had to go home to Rialto and do what was right. Make peace, marry, and make her father happy. Never mind whatever the future held for empires and queens." Oh, how she wished she could stay here with him. And his horse. Perhaps if she thought hard enough, she might find a way to do all of those things. 36. Penelope settled deeper into Godfrey's arms as they flew, letting out a sigh of contentment. She couldn't explain why she felt so comfortable with a man she barely knew, yet she did. His embrace felt like the most natural place to be, and her thoughts strayed back to their kiss in the chapel. The sheer thrill bubbling through her blood as their lips touched, before the heat between them had burned deeper into a desire to do the unforgivable, and use the altar for a communion of body and soul that had nothing to do with the church or anyone else but the two of them. The reverence in his every touch had only made desire burn hotter, and now they were so close again, the fire had begun to smolder within. Of all the men in the world, Godfrey was the only one she wanted. And she had begun to believe she might be able to have him. Penelope laughed softly. I had begun to believe that all men below a certain age thought only with what lies between their legs, but— Forgive me, Lady Penelope, Godfrey interrupted, and the delicious memory evaporated as though it had never been. Suddenly bereft, it took her a moment to realize that the memory she'd seen was as much his as hers. They'd both been thinking about the same thing. So was the urge to lie down on the altar his idea or hers? He continued, I'd forgotten how you can read my thoughts, and being so close to you, I allowed my thoughts to wander into a place where they did not belong. His thoughts fixed on an icy stream, and the memory of jumping into the water. So cold even, she gasped, pressing back against him, and the reassuring warmth that the immersion was no more than a memory. Your thoughts mirrored my own, and you're wrong. You're not like the other men I've known. Most of them think of mastering me, possessing me, with a violence like that suffered by your sister. They do not see a face, merely a body. They mean to leave me broken, beaten, conquered, my defenses battered by what they believe is a mighty battering ram, but is in fact little more than a piece of gristle. She shook her head to clear the images of Magnus, Marco, and even the magician's lustful thoughts. But your thoughts are of me, of us, of the joy in coming together, touching, wanting. The icy clouds they flew through were not enough to cool her flaming cheeks. I think we should find a town with an inn. Even as she voiced her wish, she felt the horse tilt beneath them, descending. Their descent pushed Godfrey even closer to her, and she could feel him hardening at the close contact. She wasn't sure which of them blushed more. Please forgive me, he breathed in her ear. The steep walls of a hilltop town loomed out of the dark, and they skimmed over the top of them, landing in a churchyard. She helped Godfrey push the horse between some bushes before taking his hand. Now to find that inn, she said. He pulled his hand out of her grasp. Lady Penelope, we cannot. You are the daughter of a duke, a duchess of Rialto. Emperors and princes are willing to go to war for you, offering a world of wealth for the right to marry you. You are destined to be an empress, a queen. I am merely a knight, and a younger son at that. All your other suitors can offer you crowns, whereas all I can give you is a chamber to share with me in my father's castle, and perhaps a horse to ride. I may dream of becoming your lover, but your place is far loftier than my lowly bed. I lost my honor a long time ago, but I am honorable enough not to steal yours. If she'd offered herself to Magnus, he would have stripped her naked by now. The magician would have done unspeakable things to her already. Yet Godfrey, sweet, honorable knight that he was, begged her to think of her own honor. I'm no duchess. Rank in Rialto is not like other places. My father's position is his alone, which he occupies only after the other nobles in Rialto voted to place him there. I'm as noble as you, Lady Penelope, the same rank as any knight. And so I shall remain. I will not marry the child prince of Bizzes, to live in a pit of vipers, waiting for one to strike me down. I will not share a bed with that rabid cur Prince Magnus, a violent man-child who believes it is his right to have his way with women when they are unwilling. She took a deep breath. If you truly wish to save me from a loveless marriage that will kill me as surely as any sword, then you must claim me for yourself. All honor demands is that you do so before a witness, a man of God, and that I am willing to do the same. She felt hope rise in his breast, stealing his breath as for a moment he considered being granted his wish. A wish he did not believe he deserved. Before Godfrey could protest, she marched up to the church's side door and rapped smartly on the timber. She could sense the sleepy priest inside, surprised by her knock, but coming to answer it anyway. She threw back the hood of her cloak, smoothing her hair and straightening her clothes. The priest would not see much in the darkness, so she would need to convey everything with her voice alone. The door swung open and the priest lifted a lantern so that he could squint at them. Yes? Penelope lifted her chin. Good evening, Father. We wish to be married. Immediately. The priest opened his mouth to protest. She reached for the pouch of coins at Godfrey's belt and pulled out a handful. We will pay you well for your trouble. The door opened wider. Come in. The priest led them to the altar and Godfrey grasped her shoulder. Are you sure about this? He hissed. She merely gave voice to the thoughts running through his head, for they were no different to her own. Marriage is for life. What God has united, no man can break apart. Be he emperor or prince or duke. You can refuse to take the oath, but I know my heart, and this is the future I choose. Marry me, Godfrey, and I will be your wife. Yours to protect, and to love. Are you ready to say your vows? The priest asked. Penelope nodded. After a moment, so did Godfrey. Then kneel, the priest commanded. The priest asked for her vow. She knew her eyes were supposed to be fixed on the cross behind the altar, but she could not help looking at Godfrey. I vow to love and honor you all the days of my life, she said, squeezing their joined hands. Oh, how she wished he could read her thoughts. Then he'd know she longed for this as much as he did. It might be madness, but it was the kind of madness she wanted her life long. He wet his lips, lifting his eyes to meet her gaze. I vow to love, honor and protect you all the days of my life, he said. The priest said a few more words before pronouncing them married. United. She wasn't sure which was more powerful, Godfrey's exaltation or her own. Did it matter? She reached out with her mind for the inn and found it beside the closed city gates. They were as surprised as the priest to see them, but the innkeeper was happy to accept gold in exchange for a meal and his best room. He sent servants up with warm water to wash with, and a meal neither of them were hungry for yet. They only wanted each other. Godfrey shooed the servants out and bolted the door. Their eyes met and Penelope couldn't suppress her grin. Kiss me. Please. It was but a moment and she was in his arms again, her lips meeting his as naturally as they had in the chapel. Only this time they would not be parted again. 37. Penelope could have kissed Godfrey forever, but even newlyweds had to pause for breath. And Godfrey had more in mind than kissing, which set her cheeks aflame all over again. My lady, let me wash away all the memories of your ordeal. He gestured for her to sit down. Obediently, she did. Godfrey stood behind her, then set his hands on her shoulders and leaned forward. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the precious gift you have given me, he whispered, sliding his fingers down so they rested over her collarbone. He meant herself, Penelope realized, finding it hard to read his thoughts amid the cloud of her own desire. She wanted him to move his hands lower, to cup her breasts too. He unfastened her cloak, then moved away from her to hang it up. She barely had a moment to register his absence before he knelt at her feet. Off came her boots until he cupped her stockinged foot in his hands. The silk had felt substantial enough while they were flying, but now it might as well be as ephemeral as mist, melting away in the heat of his touch as his fingers slid up her leg. Her garter halted him, but only for a moment before he ventured higher still, laying a hand on her bare thigh. A question burned in his eyes and she had to concentrate to see the thought forming in his mind. If her stockings only went up to her knees and he had his hands beneath all her skirts, he had only to lift them higher and she would be bare to the waist and ready for him. She trembled at the thought, but she swallowed and nodded. Never had she been so nervous and at the same time so eager. If he were to lift her skirts and move between her thighs, she would willingly rise to meet him. Maybe even leap into his lap. Godfrey smiled as though he could read her thoughts now, then lowered his hand to untie her garter. He slid her stocking off slowly, stroking the silk down her skin until she shivered again, before he did the same with her other stocking. Now she knew why women covered their ankles in public. To feel the breeze caress her skin like her husband was now would drive her to distraction. Was driving her to distraction. He lifted the hem of her skirts, bundling them into her lap to bare her legs. Yes. Oh yes. Please. Godfrey laughed softly, then reached for the jug of water and a cloth. Time to wash away the travel dust and the memories, he said, a moment before the warm damp cloth touched her thigh. With deft strokes, he washed her leg from hip to heel, drawing ever closer to her most secret places, without actually touching her there. One leg, then the other, leaving her skin tingling and the rest of her aching for its turn. He set the water on the table and clambered to his feet, then held out his hands. Rise, my lady. Her skirts tumbled down about her ankles, covering her again, yet she'd never felt so naked. The ghostly echo of his caresses even as his hands held hers, combined with the hunger in his eyes as he looked at her, saw her, it stole her breath away. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. His hand cupped the back of her neck as he deepened the kiss. 1,000 butterflies burst into flight in her breast, as he unfastened her shift and bared her neck and shoulders. But for the lacing of her gown, he would have exposed her breasts as well. Her fingers moved almost of their own accord to rectify the situation, but he caught her hands in his and looped them around his neck once more. Patience, my lady, he said, reaching for the washcloth. She closed her eyes as he stroked the cloth over her shoulders, down her throat, tracing her collarbone before caressing the tops of her breasts. Then the cloth was gone, replaced by his lips, kissing a trail of fire across her skin. Penelope threw her head back and moaned aloud. He could just pick her up, push up her skirts and pin her against the wall. She would open to him like a flower to the sun, like air. Like a prostitute in an alley, down by the docks. The thought was his, not hers, but it was tinted with amusement. He was teasing her, deliberately imagining things that might make her change her mind. Almost as if he wished she would come to her senses and see him for what he was. A brave, honorable knight who had come to save her when no one else would. Her knight and now her husband. She would meet his challenge, for she had read the thoughts of sailors and whores alike. And she intended to enjoy her first night with him, far more than any prostitute, who had to fake her pleasure for her customer's coin. I believe 'tis cheaper to have stand-up sex in an alley, than in a bed in a brothel. But if my husband insists, the alley behind the inn is empty at the moment. Godfrey's mouth dropped open with shock. He hadn't expected such salty language from his convent-raised lady. He recovered quickly. When I make love to you for the first time, it shall be in a bed. For if you truly are determined to consummate this marriage, madness though it may be, I will give you no cause to regret your choice. From levity to seriousness in a moment, yet even with her blood fair boiling with desire, she knew this was the wisest course. I have no regrets, she said simply, undoing the lacings of her gown before he could stop her. Her clothes wilted to the floor, along with any whispering doubts she might have had. She stood naked before him, arms spread. Behold your willing bride. He looked her up and down for a long moment, his thoughts revealing nothing but the curves of her body, pale skin that had never seen the sun now revealed in the lantern light for him alone. Just an ordinary woman. Not worth waging a war over. She managed a small smile, hoping her equally small jest might provoke some reaction from him. He reached for the jug of wine, then poured himself a cup. He lifted it to his lips as he regarded her again. Godfrey drank deeply, his thoughts darting about her body like a swarm of bees. The silkiness of her skin, the pink pearls of her nipples, the tight curls at the juncture of her thighs, the weight of her breasts in his hands, the softness of her behind as he pulled her to him, the flush of her cheeks as her eyes kindled with desire, piercing his very soul with longing. His soul or hers? She wasn't sure any more where his thoughts ended and hers began. Restraint be damned. I cannot resist you any longer, he growled. He seized her and kissed her. She expected him to be rough, but his every movement was firm and deliberate. He would never hurt her. She pressed against him, gasping as her tender nipples rasped against his tunic, a new one he'd brought from home. Better than being dressed like a friar, a man vowed to celibacy. That would never do. It was her turn to lift his hem, to tug the tunic over his head and throw it onto the floor. Then her turn to gasp again as she traced the muscles he'd hidden beneath the shapeless garment. Why, he was built like the ancient statues, all hard ridges but warm like no statue she'd ever seen. She hadn't believed it was possible to want him more, and yet. He scooped her up effortlessly and tossed her onto the bed, where she found she could regard him properly, so she just lay back on her elbows and looked. A wry smile twisted his lips as he spread his arms wide just as she had. Behold, your knight without his armor. Fine muscles indeed, with a trail of hair that led into his hose and further hardness. Her cheeks heated again, searing her mouth to desert dryness. She wanted to tell him to take off his hose, to come to bed, to kiss her, to claim her, to do all the things he'd dreamed about and more, but her voice seemed to have died. Please, she whispered, the only word she could say. The hose vanished as if by magic, and he lay his body beside hers on the bed. He slid a finger under her chin, lifting her eyes to meet his, and all individual thoughts were lost. She was his and he was hers, two waves crashing together in an ocean of desire that consumed them both. Utterly. Completely. When the swirling tempestuous waves within her reached their peak, she found her voice again, screaming Godfrey's name until she had no breath left. But he was there, kissing the breath back into her body, coaxing her to new, undreamed of heights until he too shouted her name to the heavens, and it seemed that two souls were truly one. 38. The sun was well and truly risen by the time Godfrey and Penelope managed to get the enchanted horse into the sky again. No matter how much he told himself they should hurry, he could not seem to bring himself to care. She was his willing wife, madness though it seemed, and no one could take away the pleasure they'd shared last night. Truly, he did not deserve her. What is that? It looks like a wave coming in and swallowing the road, or I don't know. And there's another one over there too. Godfrey followed her pointing finger. That's an army on the move. Two armies on the move. Both headed for Rialto. Dread curdled in his stomach. But Rialto has warships and defenses, right? He peered across the water. I can see the ships now. Penelope leaned forward, squinting. Rialto has no warships at the moment, not since Duke Vitali died. Father hasn't commissioned a new war fleet yet. Those are Northmen vessels, built for rougher and deeper seas than ours. Which would mean 3 armies headed for Rialto. Her calm tone was maddening. Perhaps she didn't know what an army could do to a city. What the infidels had done to the holy city. What the crusaders had done to everywhere they went. We have to do something. Warn them. Or we won't be safe here. You won't be safe here. Penelope shook her head. Rialto is not like other cities. No army has ever taken it, and they will not do so now. We will fly to my father's palace and tell him what is coming. And then we wait. For them to send their envoys. Then the negotiations will begin. But they have armies. Armies cannot walk on water, and those deep-water ships cannot negotiate the shoals and shallows of the Rialto lagoon. There are not enough gondolas in the lagoon to transport 1 army, let alone 3, and even then, they might not be willing to pay the boatman's price. She patted Godfrey's arm. I may not know much about swords or horses or battle, but I was born in Rialto, raised listening to merchants making bargains every minute of every day. When the envoys come, and they will, I will work out what they want, and are willing to sacrifice for it. I will tell you, and you will advise my father and his council accordingly. When there are 3 armies camped around Rialto, the safest place to be is Rialto itself. You shall see. Either she was incredibly naive, or she knew more about politics than Godfrey could even imagine. Neither was a particularly comforting thought, but, because he had no better plan, he headed for the ducal palace. For whatever the armies meant to do, he had a quest to fulfill. 39. By the time they reached the ducal palace, Father was already busy with his council, and the reception hall was full of important people, also waiting their turn to see him. Penelope settled in for a long wait, made more pleasant when the servants recognized her and brought refreshments. "How long will this take?" Godfrey asked, peering at the other groups, unaware that he'd said the same thing as 3 other men at almost the exact same time. Penelope shrugged. "As long as it takes. It looks like the army sent envoys ahead of them, and most of them are already here. The Northmen, they are upset because they heard Emperor Frederick's son was to marry me instead of their king's sister, as there is a long-standing betrothal. All Emperor Frederick has to do is agree to celebrate the marriage immediately, and they will be satisfied. Now Frederick's people are less easy to please. Your father received Count Vazwan's letter and sent his answer to Prince Magnus, who considers his refusal a great insult to himself and his father. He has persuaded his brothers and their army to support him, but all he really wants is to marry some woman other than the Northman's king's sister. I think the betrothal is with his older brother anyway, but I can't be sure. Oh, and there's the matter of Frederick's claim to the title of emperor. It appears the present pope has not approved it, and Frederick is willing to negotiate with him to make things official. But in order to do that, he'll need the support of the Northmen and Rialto. Perhaps even Emperor Manuel as well. So even if they've ostensibly come here at Magnus's insistence, they have more important things to discuss. The army from Bizes. Now they're interesting. The emperor still holds our people in his prison, but he's willing to negotiate for their release if we hand him I believe he wants the magician. And possibly his flying horse. He's come here in search of him because Gabrielle admitted to being from Rialto, and he was headed this way when he left Bizes. But Emperor Manuel has a problem. If he releases our people, they will demand compensation for their stolen goods and businesses, and that will beggar the royal treasury, so he will be willing to do anything for gold to fill those empty coffers, up to and including marrying his young sons to rich women. The Northman bride comes with a crown but little dowry, which is why he wanted me. When he finds out I am already married, he will look elsewhere, likely to Emperor Frederick, who might have an eligible daughter or 2. Manuel's daughter might do for Magnus. She's old enough for marriage, and has a peculiar hobby involving torture implements in her father's dungeons, so the 2 of them should get along nicely. So, with a few marriage alliances and a fair bit of gold changing hands, we can probably send most of them away from here, not entirely unhappy. Godfrey shook his head. He would never understand politics like she did. Never. And what does Rialto want? She smiled. Oh, the same as always. More autonomy, fewer tariffs and taxes. More opportunities to make money. My father and his council are all from good merchant families. They will act to further Rialto's trade interests. Merely hosting these negotiations will increase Rialto's power immeasurably, for it is in all their interests to see Rialto endure to prolong the peace. And what about the Pope? What will he want? Penelope laughed. A man of God, head of the church, I am sure he wants many holy things, as is proper. But most of all, he will want a new crusade, particularly after the failure of this last one, and he knows Rialto is the best port to launch one from. If Rialto calls, he will come and at least listen to what these kings and emperors have to say. So that when he or his successor calls for another crusade, Rialto will rebuild its war fleet, and answer his call. Lady Penelope, Duke Sebastiano will see you now. This earned them the animosity of most of the other men in the room, but this didn't seem to bother Penelope. She followed her father's man to his office, where she abandoned all decorum and ran to embrace her father. The Duke did not want to let her go, holding her at arm's length as he studied her face, her clothes, and even her boots. "Are you well?" he asked cautiously. Penelope laughed. "Well enough to try to sell a man the finest Rialto lace, so fine only men who are truly noble may see it. My ill luck that Count Vesone was an honest man, who thought me mad when he could not see the cloth." The Duke managed a weak smile. "And the rogue who kidnapped you?" "Gabrielle is dead. Slain by Magnus, one of Emperor Frederick's sons. I believe Emperor Manuel offered his daughter in marriage to the man who could bring him Gabrielle's head, so you might want to suggest the alliance yourself." Sebastiano nodded thoughtfully. "I suspect you have quite a tale to tell. I fear I have little time to spare today, but if your tale might help to explain why 3 armies are circling our fair city, perhaps I must make the time." The Duke called for refreshments, before Penelope and Godfrey told their tale. Finally, Godfrey reached the part where they'd arrived at his father's house, and reached over to pour another cup of wine, but the jug was empty. "I fear there is little more to tell, father, for I know you are busy." "I have never seen your reception hall so full," Penelope said. Sebastiano nodded, then turned to Godfrey. "Thank you. I cannot express how grateful I am that you brought her back. If there is ever anything I can do for you—" Godfrey swallowed. "It was now or never. There is only one thing I would ask of you. A small thing, really. Penelope interrupted, squeezing Godfrey's hand. "We would like to ask you to bless our marriage." Father suddenly grew very still. Then he shook himself and said, "Sir Godfrey, would you be so kind as to take the wine jug and find a servant who will refill it? I can't imagine where they have all gone to." Godfrey glanced at her and registered her slight nod before taking the wine jug. "Of course, Monseigneur." He slipped out of the room. Father considered several suitable ways to start the conversation, but Penelope had waited long enough. She wet her lips. The Bizes princes are children, their treasury is empty, and it is only a matter of time before a palace coup occurs. Frederick's elder sons might be nice enough, but they have a feudal government that we have no desire to see here. To marry one of them would put Rialto at risk. Gabrielle, Marco, and all the young merchants or merchant sons here, they would want my dowry, and even I know it was lost somewhere in the northern seas. My brothers would not allow you to beggar the family business, to make another family rich. Was there ever anyone you considered good enough to marry me?" Father sighed. "You're right. No, I never met a man I considered good enough for you. The one thing you asked me for, a husband who will make you happy, that I cannot give you. Sir Godfrey makes me happy. He searched everywhere until he found me and stole me from under the nose of Prince Magnus himself, who planned to force me into marriage." "But a horse trader?" Penelope smiled. "We visited his family home. His father is a feudal baron, it's true, but Godfrey has older brothers who will inherit the title, while he is merely a knight. And the horses, such horses. The finest ever bred. Emperor Frederick knows the value of them already, and Emperor Manuel can be made to know it in time. There is some value in being the merchant who represents both the buyer's and the breeder's interests, particularly when many of them are kings. You should have been born a boy. I swear, you are more astute than your brothers when it comes to some things. But then, I wouldn't be able to be your favorite daughter. Or Sir Godfrey's wife." Father's forehead crinkled. "Do you truly wish to marry the man? Will he make you happy?" Penelope rose. "Godfrey and I are already married, and he does make me happy. And if you give us your blessing, we will stay until the peace treaties are signed, but if you do not, we shall leave, she thought as she fixed her gaze on her father. He sighed. I will tell the servants to prepare a guest apartment for you both here in the palace. I have plans for the campo, and I would love to ask you what you think. Penelope beamed. Thank you, father. 40. The summer sun shone on Penelope's bare feet, as she dangled them over the canal. The enchanted horse lurked beneath the surface, ready to be buried and forgotten when the canal was filled in on the morrow. She reached for another peach. The trees had been moved to another island, and where they had once grown was now covered in cobblestones, set in such a way that they looked like fish scales. Soon the whole campo, including the canal beneath her feet, would be paved over to become St. Mark's Square, where two emperors, a Northman king, the Pope and her father would sign the peace treaties that divided the world between them. 3 princes and 3 princesses would be married, and the hostilities would be over. They would all stay to witness the annual ceremony where the Duke walked out to the edge of the sandbank protecting the city, and said the city's marriage vows to the sea. This year, the Pope had not only agreed to officiate, but he'd given the Duke a gold ring to throw into the water to signify how he blessed the union. It seemed almost an anticlimax to have weddings instead of a big battle, but that's how things were done in the Republic of Rialto. What do you want to do next? Godfrey asked Penelope. She threw her peach stone into the canal. Hope there is something cool to drink in the kitchen. It used to be lovely here under the trees, but now the sun beats down on you unmercifully. He chuckled. I mean after the treaties are signed. Would you like to live here or come home with me where we can ride every day, or did you have some other adventure in mind? Penelope considered. I would like to spend the rest of the summer somewhere cooler. And there's my dowry. My brothers used it to finance a shipping expedition to the northern seas, but the ship and cargo were taken by pirates after reaching Beacon Isle. Once the treaty is signed, we could find a ship headed to northern waters and see if we can find my dowry, along with the rest of the pirate treasure. Godfrey laughed, then realized she hadn't joined him. You mean you are serious? Penelope shrugged. It's a sizable sum. Well worth tracking down, so that any children we have might have the money to join my family business in Rialto if that is their wish, or buy more breeding stock for your horse herds. She smiled. More importantly, it is another adventure, where we will not have to worry about saving one another. Just enjoy things as they happen. Will you take me on an adventure, Sir Godfrey? Just a knight and his lady, no one else? He could not refuse her anything, and she knew it. If you want an adventure, my lovely lady wife, then you shall have one. I hear the pirates around Beacon Isle are quite lovely this time of year. Has been. Float. Enchanted Horse Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.